137.8%. That's Italy's government debt-to-GDP ratio as of September 2025, the highest among major Eurozone economies. France sits at 109.6%, Spain at 107.5%, Germany at just 64.8%. Italy stands alone at the top, carrying debt nearly double Germany's relative burden. But here's what most people miss. This isn't just about numbers on a balance sheet. This is about a structural trap that has locked Italy into permanent economic underperformance for over 2 decades. Most observers see Italy as a temporarily struggling economy that will eventually recover another European nation, weathering short-term challenges. They're wrong. Italy's problems aren't cyclical, they're systemic. And the combination of crushing debt, productivity collapse, and demographic decline has created an economic death spiral that becomes harder to escape with each passing year. The perception: Italy is a wealthy G7 nation with world-class manufacturing, strong exports, and a resilient economy that has survived worse crises before. The reality: Italy's GDP per capita hasn't meaningfully grown since 2000. While Germany, France, the UK, and even Spain have expanded their economies over the past quarter century, Italy has stagnated. Real GDP growth in 2024 reached just 0.7%, among the lowest in the Eurozone. For 2025, the European Commission forecasts a mere 0.4% expansion, not recession, but barely alive. This is the new normal. How did one of Europe's founding economic powers, the world's 8th largest economy, become the sick man of the continent? The answer lies in 3 interconnected crises: a debt trap inherited from decades of fiscal mismanagement, a productivity collapse that began in the mid-1990s, and a demographic time bomb that makes both problems unsolvable through traditional means. These aren't separate issues. They feed into each other, creating a vicious cycle where debt constrains growth. Low growth reduces productivity, investment, and productivity stagnation makes the debt burden heavier. Italy's total debt, government, corporate, and household combined, now stands at 556.8% of GDP. 556.8%. That's not a typo. For every euro of annual economic output, Italy owes 5.5 euros in total debt. This figure, reported by CEIC data in the third quarter of 2024, represents one of the highest debt loads among developed economies globally. To put this in perspective, the United States, frequently criticized for its own debt problems, has total debt around 350% of GDP. Japan, the poster child for high government debt, carries total debt around 600%, but Japan controls its own currency, maintains near-zero interest rates, and finances most debt domestically. Italy has none of these advantages. It cannot print euros, it cannot set its own interest rates, and increasingly, it depends on foreign creditors who demand higher yields to compensate for risk. Government debt alone, at 137.8% of GDP, costs Italy over 4% of GDP annually in interest payments. 4%. That's more than Italy spends on education, more than defense, more than infrastructure, just servicing existing debt. And with the European Central Bank raising interest rates from negative territory in 2022 to current levels above 3%, Italy's debt servicing costs have exploded. The interest rate growth rate differential, the gap between what Italy pays on debt and how fast its economy grows, has turned decisively negative, meaning debt grows faster than the economy's ability to service it. The European Commission's autumn 2025 forecast projects Italy's debt-to-GDP ratio will reach 137.2% by the end of 2027, barely declining despite promised fiscal consolidation. Why? Because even with primary budget surpluses, government revenue exceeding spending before interest payments, the surpluses aren't large enough to offset rising debt costs. Italy needs to find approximately 135 billion euros in fiscal consolidation over the next several years just to stabilize the debt ratio. 135 billion euros. That's equivalent to 7% of Italy's entire GDP. Meanwhile, GDP growth remains anemic. After recording 0.7% growth in 2024, the same stagnant pace as 2023, Italy is forecast to grow just 0.4% in 2025. Net exports are subtracting 0.7 percentage points from growth as global trade slows. Domestic demand contributes approximately 1 percentage point, driven primarily by investment rather than consumption. But this investment is fragile. dependent almost entirely on European Union Recovery and Resilience Facility funds that will disappear by 2026. The latest data from Italy's statistical office, Istat, reveals the composition of this weak growth. Household consumption increased just 0.4% year-over-year in 2024. Government expenditure jumped 1.1%. Exports rose a meager 0.4%, while imports contracted 0.7%, suggesting not export competitiveness, but rather demand destruction. By sector, agriculture showed 2% growth, construction managed 1.2%, and services grew 0.6%. Manufacturing, Italy's traditional strength, declined 0.1%. This manufacturing contraction is particularly ominous. The HCOB Italy Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, which tracks new orders, output, and employment, registered 47.4 in February 2025. Any reading below 50 indicates contraction. Italy's manufacturing sector has been shrinking for nearly a full year, with February's reading representing the most modest contraction in 5 months, meaning things are getting worse more slowly, not actually improving. Labour productivity continues its decades-long decline, despite employment rising 1% in 2024, continuing cumulative growth of 3.5% over 2023 and 2024. Productivity fell as more workers produced less output. The IMF's latest country report on Italy notes that labour productivity growth has contributed minimally to GDP expansion, with total factor productivity remaining essentially flat or negative in recent years. This creates a paradox. Italy has strong employment numbers, unemployment forecast to decline steadily to 5.9% by 2027, but these workers are becoming less productive over time. When an economy adds jobs but output barely grows, it means each worker is producing less value. This is the opposite of economic development, where rising productivity allows fewer workers to generate more output, freeing labour for new industries and innovations. The fiscal situation remains dire despite recent improvements. Italy's budget deficit declined sharply from 7.2% of GDP in 2023 to 3.4% in 2024, but this improvement is temporary and partly artificial. Much of the deficit reduction came from phasing out energy support measures worth approximately 1% of GDP and from one-time revenue increases. The European Commission forecasts the deficit will narrow to 3.0% in 2025, 2.8% in 2026, and 2.6% in 2027, meeting the EU's 3% threshold, but only through continued fiscal austerity. Here's the trap. Italy needs fiscal discipline to stabilize debt, but fiscal consolidation suppresses growth, which makes the debt burden heavier relative to GDP, which requires more fiscal discipline, which further suppresses growth. This doom loop has no easy exit. Countries typically escape high debt through some combination of economic growth, inflation, default, or financial repression. Italy has limited options for any of these. Recent policy decisions have made the situation worse. The super bonus, tax credit scheme for building renovations intended to stimulate construction and energy efficiency, generated €122.2 billion in tax credits through 2024. The program temporarily boosted GDP by around 2.4 percentage points over 2021 through 2024 and drove nearly 40% growth in construction activity. But the fiscal costs have been catastrophic. The Italian Fiscal Council estimates the super bonus will add almost 2 percentage points to the debt-to-GDP ratio annually over the next 3 years, compared to an average 0.5 percentage point increase in 2021 through 2023. The program's economics reveal Italy's structural problem. It can generate temporary growth through massive fiscal stimulus, but the growth disappears when the stimulus ends, leaving only higher debt. Construction activity is now declining as the super bonus phases out, with investment growth projected at 0% in 2025, after just 0.4% in 2024, down from 8.7% in 2023. The debt remains permanent, while the growth was temporary. Italy's Recovery and Resilience Plan, the country's allocation of European Union pandemic recovery funds, faces similar implementation challenges. Italy received €194.4 billion in grants and loans, equivalent to approximately 10% of GDP. But as of March 2024, only 23%, or €45 billion, had actually been spent, despite receiving 53% of allocated funds. The remaining €150 billion must be deployed by 2026, meaning Italy needs to spend approximately 7% of GDP annually in the next 2 to 3 years. This creates enormous pressure to identify and execute projects quickly, increasing the risk of waste, corruption, and misallocation. Delays in RRF spending threaten the plan's potential contribution to medium-term growth, which is crucial for stabilizing Italy's debt trajectory. If Italy cannot effectively deploy these funds, it loses both the short-term GDP boost from investment and the long-term productivity gains the reforms were designed to generate. The bond market remains cautiously optimistic but increasingly nervous. Italian 10-year government bond yields have declined from the dangerous levels of November 2011, when yields approached 7%, the threshold where market access becomes problematic to current levels, around 3.5 to 4%. But this relative calm depends entirely on the European Central Bank's implicit backstop through its bond purchasing programs. Any signal that ECB support might weaken sends Italian yields spiking, as markets remember that Italy's debt is ultimately unsustainable without external support. Credit rating agencies maintain Italy's investment-grade status, but with limited cushion. Moody's confirmed Italy's rating at bar 3, just 3 notches above junk status in May 2025, improving the outlook from stable to positive based on government efforts to control debt and the strength of Italian household savings. S&P confirmed Italy at BBB with a stable outlook in October 2025. These ratings reflect not confidence in Italy's economy, but rather the floor provided by EU institutional support and domestic savings. Italy's economic stagnation isn't primarily a debt story, it's a productivity story. The debt is the consequence, not the cause. To understand why Italy is trapped, we need to examine what happened to Italian productivity starting in the mid-1990s and why it has never recovered. In the 1980s and 1990s, Italy's real GDP growth averaged around 2% annually. Not spectacular, but respectable for a mature economy. Then something broke. Since 2000, Italy's GDP per capita has grown by less than 0.5% annually, effectively zero when accounting for measurement error. Over the same period, Germany grew 25% richer per capita. France grew 18%. Even Spain, despite its catastrophic housing crisis and sovereign debt crisis, grew 12%. Italy grew approximately 3% over 25 years. This isn't recession. Recessions are temporary contractions followed by recovery. This is stagnation, a permanent downshift in economic performance that shows no signs of reversing. And at the heart of this stagnation lies the collapse of total factor productivity. Total factor productivity, TFP, measures how efficiently an economy converts inputs like capital and labor into outputs. It captures everything that isn't explained by simply adding more workers or more machines. Technological progress, innovation, management quality, institutional efficiency, resource allocation. TFP is the soul of economic growth, and Italy's TFP has been dying for 30 years. Research published in the Italian Economic Journal documents Italy's TFP trajectory across major economies from 1954 to 2017. From the 1950s through the 1980s, Italy's TFP grew at 1.18%, annually slower than Germany's 1.59% and France's 1.45%, but comparable to Japan and Spain. Then came the cliff. Between 2008 and 2017, Italy's TFP declined by 0.48% per year, negative 0.48%. France declined 0.2%. Spain declined 0.12%. Germany, the UK, the US, and Japan all maintained positive TFP growth. Italy's TFP decline was the worst among developed economies. And this wasn't just a financial crisis effect. Italy's productivity stagnation began in the mid-1990s, over a decade before the global financial crisis. Manufacturing TFP data from EU CLEMS shows the timeline clearly. Italian manufacturing TFP grew steadily from 1970 through 1995, roughly tracking France and Germany. Then it flatlined. By 2010, French and German manufacturing TFP had continued rising, while Italy's had barely moved. The gap widened every year. The Conference Board's Total Economy database, which tracks productivity across 130 economies, places Italy in what researchers call the falling behind group economies, where labour productivity levels have remained virtually unchanged since the mid-1990s. Italy's labour productivity stood at approximately $62 per hour, worked in 2019, measured in purchasing power parity terms. This matched the European average, but concealed Italy's stagnation. While other European economies were converging toward higher productivity levels, Italy was standing still. Decomposing productivity growth reveals where Italy fails. Labour productivity growth comes from three sources: capital deepening, investing in better machines and infrastructure; labour composition, upgrading workforce skills and education; and total factor productivity, everything else, primarily innovation and efficiency. The European Central Bank's analysis shows that Italy's capital deepening contribution has been weak, labour composition improvements minimal, and TFP growth negative. All three cylinders are misfiring. The CEPR Centre for Economic Policy Research published research showing that if Italy's resource misallocation had remained at 1995 levels, aggregate TFP in 2013 would have been 18% higher than actual levels. 18%. That would have translated into approximately 1% higher GDP growth per year, enough to close most of Italy's growth gap with France and Germany. Instead, misallocation has increased every year since 1995. What does misallocation mean? It means productive resources, capital, and labour are flowing to the wrong places. Efficient economies channel resources toward high productivity firms and sectors. Italian resources flow toward low productivity firms and sectors. Research using firm-level data shows that Italy's TFP in manufacturing is 5.77% lower than if resources were allocated randomly across firms. Random allocation, literally throwing capital and labour at firms without any selection process, would improve Italian productivity by nearly 6%. This suggests that Italy's allocation process is worse than random. It's systematically bad. The pattern shows up in sectoral investment data. Between 1995 and 2006, Italy invested more heavily in sectors that experienced lower TFP growth, while Germany did the opposite, investing in high TFP growth sectors. Bank lending data from the Bank of Italy confirms this pattern. Credit flows to low productivity sectors and firms, while high productivity sectors face credit constraints. This is the opposite of what efficient capital markets should do. Why is Italian resource allocation so inefficient? The answer involves multiple structural failures that have compounded over decades. Trap 1. The small firm problem. Italy's economy is dominated by small and medium enterprises, SMEs, to an unusual degree. Over 95% of Italian firms employ fewer than 50 people. The average Italian firm has approximately 4 employees. This isn't entrepreneurial dynamism, it's fragmentation. Small firms have lower productivity than large firms across virtually every sector and country. This is a statistical regularity, not an ideological claim. Large firms can exploit economies of scale, invest in research and development, adopt advanced technologies, hire specialized managers, and access capital markets efficiently. Small firms cannot. But Italy's small firm structure isn't market-driven, it's policy-driven. Italian labor regulations, tax systems, and administrative burdens create massive incentives for firms to stay small. Companies with more than 15 employees face significantly stricter firing regulations under Article 18 of the Workers' Statute. Firms with more than 50 employees face additional administrative requirements and union obligations. The tax system favors small enterprises through simplified regimes and lower compliance costs. The result? Italian firms grow until they hit these regulatory thresholds, then stop growing. Research shows an unusual clustering of Italian firms just below 15 employees and just below 50 employees, exactly where regulatory burdens jump. This isn't coincidence. It's rational response to irrational incentives. But it destroys productivity growth, because productivity improvements typically come from firms scaling up, not from keeping firms artificially small. The Productivity Institute's analysis found that Italy's productivity levels have remained essentially unchanged since the mid-1990s, with small firm structure as a primary cause. Italian firms cannot achieve the scale necessary to invest in productivity-enhancing technologies, cannot afford specialized management talent, and cannot compete globally except in narrow artisanal niches. This creates an economy of lifestyle businesses rather than growth companies. Trap 2. The innovation deficit. Italy's gross domestic expenditure on research and development stood at 1.3% of GDP in 2023, according to Eurostat. The European Union average is 2.2%. Germany spends approximately 3%. The United States, Japan, and South Korea spend between 3 and 5%. Italy is not even trying to compete in high value-added technologies. The gap isn't just aggregate spending, It's the composition of R&D investment. In successful innovation economies, private sector R&D spending exceeds public sector spending by a large margin. Companies invest in research because they expect commercial returns. In Italy, R&D investment is heavily skewed toward universities and public research institutions, with weak industry participation. This creates academic research that doesn't translate into commercial innovation. Italy's patent applications, scientific publications, and technology transfer rates all lag European peers. The country produces excellent academic research in certain fields, but fails to commercialize discoveries. This is sometimes called the European paradox: strong science, weak innovation, but Italy exemplifies it more than most European countries. The IMF's 2025 country report on Italy notes that addressing the innovation gap requires not just higher R&D spending, fundamental reforms to how research is organized, funded, and connected to industry. Italy lacks the venture capital ecosystem, the management culture, and the institutional frameworks that convert scientific knowledge into economic value. Silicon Valley exists, not because Americans are smarter, but because institutional structures channel capital and talent toward commercial innovation. Italy has no equivalent system. Trap 3. Management Quality and Family Ownership Research, by Nicholas Bloom and collaborators, published in the American Economic Review documents that Italian firms have among the worst management practices in the developed world. Using standardized interviews across thousands of firms in multiple countries, they scored management quality on objective criteria: performance monitoring, target setting, talent management, and operational execution. Italian firms scored systematically lower than American, German, Japanese, and even British firms. The management practices Italian firms get wrong are precisely those that enable ICT information and communication technology adoption and exploitation. Given that ICT penetration was the primary driver of productivity acceleration in the United States and Northern Europe since the mid-1990s, Italy's management failures directly explain its productivity stagnation. Why are Italian management practices so poor? Family ownership. Italy has the highest rate of family-owned and family-managed firms among developed economies. Family ownership isn't inherently bad. Many successful companies are family-owned. But Italian family firms suffer from specific pathologies: succession to eldest sons, regardless of competence, resistance to professional management, nepotism over meritocracy, and extreme risk aversion. SEPA research titled Productivity in Italy, The Great Unlearning, argues that Italy isn't failing to learn modern management practices. It's actively unlearning the management capabilities it once had. Post-war Italian industrial giants like Fiat, Olivetti, and Pirelli were professionally managed, innovative, and globally competitive. Since the 1980s, Italian business culture has regressed toward family control, local networks, and resistance to change. This is unlearning, and it shows in productivity data. The digital divide compounds this problem. Figure 5 from CEPR research shows ICT investment as a share of total investment for Italy, France, and Germany. Italy consistently trails both countries by significant margins. Italian firms adopted computers later, adopted internet technologies later, and are now adopting artificial intelligence and advanced analytics later than peers. Each wave of technological change widens the gap. But the technology gap isn't about access to technology. Italy can buy the same computers, software, and machinery as Germany. It's about organizational capacity to use technology effectively. Poor management practices prevent Italian firms from extracting value from ICT investments. They buy the technology, fail to reorganize work processes around it, fail to train workers adequately, and then wonder why productivity doesn't improve. Trap 4. Institutional sclerosis. And the North-South divide. Italy isn't one economy. It's two economies trapped in one political system. Northern Italy, Lombardy, Veneto, Emilia-Romagna, Piedmont has productivity levels, incomes, and institutional quality comparable to Germany or France. Southern Italy, Campania, Calabria, Sicily, Sardinia has productivity levels, incomes, and institutional quality comparable to Eastern Europe or parts of the developing world. The gap is enormous. GDP per capita in Lombardy exceeds €40,000. GDP per capita in Calabria is below €18,000. That's a 2-to-1 income gap within a single country with a single currency, single labor market, and single legal system. Regional data from the Bank of Italy shows that Lazio, containing Rome and the national government, has the highest gross public debt among regions at €28.3 billion, 24.3% of all regional debt. Campania has €15.6 billion. Sicily, Lombardy, and Piedmont each carry over €10 billion in regional debt. Meanwhile, Friuli, Venezia, Giulia, Emilia-Romagna, and Sardinia have worked to consolidate public accounts and reduce debt burdens. Valle d'Aosta, Molise, and Basilicata maintain debt below €1 billion. The regional heterogeneity reflects fundamentally different institutional environments. Southern Italy suffers from weak rule of law, organized crime infiltration of government and business, corrupt public administration, and extractive rather than productive economic behavior. Transparency International's corruption perception rankings, World Bank governance indicators, and European Quality of Government Index all show Southern Italy scoring far below Northern Italy and below the European average. This matters for productivity because institutions determine resource allocation. In high-quality institutional environments, resources flow to productive uses. In low-quality institutional environments, resources flow to politically connected uses. Research shows that southern Italian regions systematically allocate public investment toward low-productivity projects with high political returns, bridges to nowhere, prestige buildings, patronage, employment. Northern regions allocate investment toward infrastructure, education, and productive capacity. The South's institutional failure drags down national averages and prevents reforms. Any national policy must accommodate Southern political interests, which often means blocking efficiency-enhancing reforms that would threaten patronage networks. Labour market reforms die because Southern politicians protect public sector employment. Tax reforms die because Southern regions depend on central government transfers. Bankruptcy reforms die because Southern business networks depend on debt forbearance. At the same time, successful Northern regions cannot escape the South's fiscal burden. Italian fiscal federalism requires Northern regions to transfer approximately €60 to €70 billion annually to Southern regions through the national budget. These transfers fund public services, pensions, and infrastructure in the South, but without addressing the institutional failures that keep the South poor. It's a permanent subsidy for dysfunction. This creates a doom loop. The South's poor institutions generate low productivity and require fiscal transfers. The transfers reduce Northern Italy's resources available for productivity-enhancing investment. The North's slower growth reduces overall Italian growth. Lower national growth makes the South's problems worse, requiring more transfers. The cycle continues. Italy's productivity, stagnation, and debt burden would be manageable barely in a stable demographic environment. But Italy faces demographic collapse that will make both problems exponentially worse. Italy's total fertility rate, the average number of children per woman over her lifetime, stands at 1.24 as of 2023. Replacement rate is 2.1. Italy is 70% below replacement. This means each generation is roughly 40% smaller than the previous generation. The implications are staggering. Italy's population peaked at 60.3 million in 2014 and has declined every year since, falling to approximately 59 million in 2025. But these headline numbers understate the crisis because they include immigration. Italy's native-born population is declining even faster, and more importantly, the working-age population, people aged 15 to 64, is collapsing. Italy's working-age population peaked in 2010 at approximately 39 million. By 2025, it has fallen to around 35 million. The European Commission forecasts continued decline to approximately 30 million by 2040, a loss of 9 million workers in 30 years. That's nearly 1/4 of the workforce disappearing. Meanwhile, the population over 65 is surging. In 2000, 13.4% of Italians were over 65. In 2025, 24.5% are over 65. By 2040, over 30% will be over 65. Italy is becoming a retirement home. The dependency ratio, the number of non-working elderly per 100 working-age adults, is already among the highest in the developed world at approximately 40. By 2040, it will exceed 60. This means every 100 workers will be supporting 60 retirees through pensions, healthcare, and social services. Currently, the ratio is 100 to 40. The mathematics don't work. Italy's pension system is already under severe stress. Pension spending consumes approximately 16% of GDP, the highest in Europe. As the dependency ratio worsens, Pension costs will rise to 20% of GDP or more unless benefits are cut dramatically. But cutting pensions is political suicide in a democracy where retirees outvote workers. The Bank of Italy's demographic projections show that labour force participation rates would need to rise dramatically to offset population aging, particularly among women and older workers. Currently, female labour force participation in Italy is approximately 53%, far below the European average of 67%, and the Nordic countries' rates above 75%. Raising Italian female participation to European averages would add approximately 3 million workers. But this requires institutional reforms Italy has failed to implement for decades. Affordable childcare, flexible work arrangements, cultural change. The alternative is immigration. Italy would need approximately 200,000 net immigrants per year just to stabilize the working-age population. Currently, Italy receives some immigration, but integration is poor and political resistance is high. The idea that Italy will successfully absorb millions of immigrants over the next 2 decades, given current political trends, seems implausible. This demographic crisis interacts catastrophically with productivity, stagnation, and debt burden. As the workforce shrinks, GDP growth depends entirely on productivity improvements. But Italian productivity is declining. As the elderly share rises, government spending on pensions and healthcare must increase. But Italian government debt is already unsustainable. As the dependency ratio worsens, savings decline, and consumption shifts from productive investment to elderly care. But Italy needs investment to escape stagnation. Every demographic projection shows Italy's potential growth rate falling below 0.5% annually by 2035, and potentially turning negative by 2040. At that point, Italy would be the first major developed economy to experience permanent economic contraction driven purely by demographics. Not recession, followed by recovery. Permanent shrinkage. The IMF scenario analysis shows that even with full implementation of the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, which assumes significant productivity gains, Italy's long-term growth rate will barely exceed 0.5% due to demographic headwinds. Without productivity improvements, Italy faces zero or negative growth indefinitely. Italy's problems would be difficult to solve with full monetary sovereignty. Within the Eurozone, they may be impossible. Countries with sovereign currencies have 3 tools for managing high debt: economic growth, inflation, and currency depreciation. Growth raises GDP, making debt smaller relative to economic size. Inflation erodes the real value of debt while raising nominal GDP. Currency depreciation boosts exports, stimulates growth, and reduces foreign debt burdens. Japan has used all 3 tools, especially inflation and currency depreciation, to manage debt exceeding 260% of GDP. Italy has none of these tools. Italy cannot print euros. That power belongs to the European Central Bank in Frankfurt. Italy cannot set interest rates. The ECB sets rates for the entire Eurozone based on German and European average conditions, not Italian needs. Italy cannot devalue the lira because the lira no longer exists. The country is locked into a currency union designed for German economic conditions, not Italian ones. This creates what economists call an asymmetric currency union, one where different regions face different economic conditions but share a single monetary policy. When Germany wants higher interest rates to fight inflation, the ECB raises rates. When Italy needs lower rates to stimulate growth, Italian needs are ignored because Italy is too small relative to the Eurozone to drive policy. The consequences are brutal. From 2008 through 2012, Italy desperately needed monetary stimulus, lower rates, quantitative easing, currency depreciation. Instead, the ECB maintained tight policy to satisfy German preferences. Italian unemployment surged above 12%. Youth unemployment exceeded 40%. GDP contracted 7%. The economy fell into depression. Only when Mario Draghi, an Italian, became ECB president in 2011 and promised to do whatever it takes to save the euro did policy shift. Draghi implemented negative interest rates, massive quantitative easing, and targeted lending programs. These policies prevented Italian collapse, but couldn't generate Italian recovery because the fundamental problems are structural, not monetary. Now, the cycle is reversing. Inflation surged in 2022 and 2023, driven by energy prices and supply chain disruptions. The ECB raised interest rates from negative 0.5% to over 4% in less than 2 years. This was necessary to fight inflation in Germany and Northern Europe, where economies were overheating, but it devastated Italy, where growth was already weak and debt servicing costs exploded. Italy's average interest rate on government debt has risen from under 2% in 2020 to over 4% in 2025. On 2.7 trillion euros of debt, that's an additional 54 billion euros per year in interest, costs nearly 3% of GDP just from higher rates. Italy must find this money through spending cuts or tax increases, both of which suppress growth, which makes the debt ratio worse, which raises borrowing costs further. This doom loop is specific to Eurozone membership. Japan's government debt exceeds Italy's by nearly 100 percentage points of GDP. But Japanese debt servicing costs are lower because the Bank of Japan controls Japanese monetary policy and keeps rates near zero. The ECB cannot do this for Italy without inflating Germany, so Italy is trapped. The Eurozone's fiscal rules compound the problem. Under the reformed Stability and Growth Pact, countries with debt above 60% of GDP must reduce their debt ratios by a specified amount each year. Italy, at 137%, must implement fiscal consolidation worth approximately 1% of GDP annually for years. This requires spending cuts, tax increases, or both, all of which suppress growth. But here's the catch. Fiscal consolidation only stabilizes debt if the economy continues growing. If consolidation causes recession, debt ratios worsen despite austerity because GDP falls faster than debt. This is exactly what happened to Greece, Portugal, Spain, and Italy itself during the Euro crisis. Austerity caused depression, which made debt ratios worse, which required more austerity, which caused deeper depression. Italy is stuck in a regime where it must implement permanent austerity to satisfy EU fiscal rules, but permanent austerity prevents the growth needed to actually reduce debt. And unlike Greece or Portugal, Italy is too large to bail out. The European Stability Mechanism, the Eurozone's crisis fund, has approximately 500 billion euros. Italy's government debt is 2.7 trillion euros. If Italy faces a sovereign debt crisis, there is no credible European rescue package. Markets know this. This is why Italian bond yields remain elevated despite ECB support. Investors understand that Italy's Eurozone membership creates an unsolvable trilemma. Italy needs growth to service debt. Growth requires monetary and fiscal stimulus, but Eurozone rules prevent both monetary sovereignty and fiscal flexibility. Something has to give. Either Italy leaves the euro, the Eurozone changes its rules fundamentally, or Italy defaults. All three options are politically unthinkable. So markets price in permanent crisis risk. Italy stands at a crossroads with three plausible scenarios over the next decade. None of them are good, but understanding the range of outcomes helps clarify what's at stake. Scenario 1. Managed stagnation. Probability. 60%. This is the path of least resistance and Italy's most likely future. The country continues muddling through with 0 to 0.5% annual growth, debt ratios hovering between 135 and 145% of GDP, periodic fiscal crises resolved by temporary ECB intervention, and gradual erosion of living standards. Under managed stagnation, Italy implements minimal reforms to satisfy EU requirements, receives continued but diminishing support from European institutions, and avoids outright crisis through a combination of high household savings, ECB backstops, and political paralysis that prevents both catastrophic decisions and meaningful improvements. The costs accumulate slowly. Each year, Italian GDP per capita falls further behind France and Germany. Each year, more young Italians emigrate to seek opportunities elsewhere, continuing the brain drain that has already cost Italy hundreds of thousands of educated workers. Each year, public infrastructure deteriorates slightly more as maintenance is deferred to meet debt payments. Each year, the pension system becomes less sustainable as fewer workers support more retirees. By 2035, under this scenario, Italy looks like 2025 but worse. Debt at 150% of GDP, growth at 0.3%, youth unemployment at 25%, the South even poorer relative to the North, and political discourse dominated by scapegoating immigrants and the European Union rather than addressing structural failures. This scenario avoids collapse but guarantees decline. Italy becomes Europe's Argentina, a once wealthy country that slowly regresses toward middle-income status through institutional dysfunction and policy paralysis. Not dramatic enough to force crisis and reform, just slow enough to allow adaptation to progressive impoverishment. Scenario 2. Reform and partial recovery probability. 25%. This optimistic scenario requires political courage Italy has not demonstrated in 30 years. A reformist government, perhaps forced by crisis or enabled by unusual political circumstances, implements comprehensive structural reforms. Labour market liberalisation, judicial reform, public administration modernisation, aggressive anti-corruption measures in the south, pension reform that raises retirement ages and reduces benefits, tax simplification that reduces evasion and broadens the base. Simultaneously, the European Union shows flexibility on fiscal rules, allowing Italy to run temporary deficits to finance productivity-enhancing investments while implementing structural reforms. The Recovery and Resilience Plan funds are deployed effectively, upgrading digital infrastructure, improving education and training systems, and catalyzing private sector innovation. Under this scenario, Italy achieves 1 to 1.5% annual growth by 2030, stabilizes debt ratios around 120%, raises productivity growth to 0.5% annually, and narrows but doesn't close the gap with European peers. This sounds modest, but it would be transformative relative to current trajectory. The challenge is political economy. Every meaningful reform creates losers who will fight to block change. Labour market reform threatens insider workers and unions. Pension reform threatens retirees who vote in large numbers. Public administration reform threatens bureaucrats with job security. Southern reform threatens patronage networks that control local politics. Italy has attempted reforms repeatedly since the 1990s. Most failed or were watered down to ineffectiveness. The Monti reforms of 2011 through 2012 achieved some labour market flexibility, but were reversed partially by subsequent governments. The Renzi reforms of 2014 through 16 attempted constitutional changes to break legislative gridlock, but were rejected in referendum. The pattern suggests Italian democracy systematically blocks reforms that would improve long-term growth at the cost of short-term pain for organised interests. For this scenario to materialise, Italy would need either a crisis severe enough to break political resistance, which leads to Scenario 3, or a generational shift in political culture that currently shows no signs of occurring. Scenario 3. Crisis and restructuring probability. 15%. The nightmare scenario, but possibly the only path to genuine transformation. A severe economic or financial crisis forces Italy to fundamentally restructure its economy and relationship with the Eurozone. The trigger could be multiple: a global recession that exposes Italy's fiscal fragility, an ECB policy shift that withdraws support for Italian bonds, a political crisis that brings an anti-Euro government to power, or a financial market panic that drives Italian yields to unsustainable levels above 7 or 8%. Under crisis conditions, Italy faces three options, all previously unthinkable. First, negotiate a debt restructuring that imposes losses on bondholders, effectively defaulting on portions of government debt to bring the total to sustainable levels. This would be the largest sovereign default in history, devastating European banks that hold Italian debt and potentially triggering a Eurozone financial crisis. Second, exit the Eurozone and reintroduce the lira, allowing currency depreciation to restore competitiveness and monetary sovereignty to manage debt. This would trigger immediate capital flight, banking crisis, and economic contraction of 10 to 20%, but might enable longer-term recovery through devaluation and independent monetary policy. The political and economic chaos would be catastrophic in the short term. Third, accept a formal EU bailout with Troika-style conditionality, surrendering fiscal sovereignty in exchange for financial support. This would mean EU-imposed reforms far more aggressive than any Italian government could implement democratically. Mass public sector layoffs, pension cuts of 30 to 40%, privatization of state assets, elimination of patronage networks. Greece experienced this during 2010 through 2015. It was politically traumatic and economically devastating, but arguably necessary to force reforms that Greek democracy could not produce voluntarily. All three crisis options involve immense short-term pain, but they might also break the political paralysis that prevents Italy from addressing structural problems. Sometimes systems must break completely before they can be rebuilt. Argentina has defaulted 9 times and remains dysfunctional, but South Korea's economic crisis in 1997 forced reforms that created the modern Korean economy. The outcome depends on whether crisis enables constructive reform or merely generates chaos. Italy's stagnation matters far beyond Italian borders. As the Eurozone's third-largest economy, Italy's instability threatens European financial integration and raises fundamental questions about the Eurozone's long-term viability. European banks hold approximately €1 trillion of Italian government debt. Italian banks hold another €500 billion. A default or restructuring would inflict losses across the European financial system, potentially triggering bank failures, credit contraction, and recession. The ECB would face an impossible choice: bail out Italy at massive cost, violating treaty prohibitions on monetary financing of governments, or allow Italian default and accept systemic financial crisis. This contingent liability explains why the ECB maintains implicit support for Italian bonds despite official denials. The central bank cannot afford Italian failure, so it provides backstops through bond purchasing programs currently paused but ready to restart if Italian yields spike. This creates moral hazard. Italy knows the ECB will ultimately intervene, reducing pressure for reform. The ECB knows Italy won't reform without pressure, creating a standoff where neither side can credibly commit to their stated positions. For global investors, Italy represents both risk and opportunity. Italian government bonds trade with yields 200 to 250 basis points above German bonds, compensating investors for political risk and default probability. This spread widens in crises, offering trading opportunities for those who can time European political cycles. But the underlying question remains unanswered. Is Italian debt ultimately backed by European institutions, or is each country on its own? Until this question is definitively resolved, Italian debt will trade with a persistent risk premium. More broadly, Italy's failure to thrive within the Eurozone demonstrates the fundamental design flaw of European monetary union. A single currency without fiscal union cannot accommodate diverse economic structures and political preferences. Germany wants low inflation and fiscal discipline. Italy needs monetary stimulus and fiscal flexibility. These preferences are irreconcilable under current institutional arrangements. Either the Eurozone moves toward genuine fiscal integration, common debt, common budget, common taxes, or it remains vulnerable to centrifugal forces that pull it apart whenever crisis strikes. Italy's weakness isn't temporary, cyclical, or amenable to conventional policy solutions. It's structural, deeply rooted, and resistant to reform because the political economy of Italian democracy systematically prevents the changes needed for recovery. The debt is unsustainable by any conventional metric, yet cannot be addressed without growth. Growth requires productivity improvements, yet productivity has declined for 30 years and shows no sign of recovery. Productivity improvements require structural reforms, yet Italian democracy blocks reforms that threaten organized interests. The Eurozone provides stability, but eliminates the monetary flexibility needed to manage asymmetric shocks. Demographics guarantee that all these problems will accelerate over the next 2 decades. This is what a trap looks like. Not a temporary difficulty, but a self-reinforcing system where each problem makes other problems worse, and solutions to any one problem are blocked by constraints created by other problems. The optimistic view points to Italian strengths: high household savings, low private debt, world-class manufacturing in specific sectors, strong exports in luxury goods and machinery, rich cultural heritage, and resilient regional economies in the north. These are real advantages, but they have not generated growth for 25 years and show no sign of doing so in the future. Strength without growth means potential without achievement. The pessimistic view sees Italy as a preview of Europe's future: aging, stagnant, debt-burdened, politically paralyzed, unable to compete with American dynamism or Chinese scale, retreating into nostalgia for past glory. If Italy, with all its advantages of location, education, infrastructure, and institutional inheritance, cannot achieve growth, what hope for the rest of southern Europe? What hope for the Eurozone as a whole when Germany faces its own demographic decline and France its own debt crisis? Italy matters because it represents the first major developed economy to enter permanent stagnation driven by productivity failure and demographic collapse. It won't be the last. Japan has shown that wealthy countries can stagnate for decades without collapsing, but Japan has monetary sovereignty, ethnic cohesion, and domestic creditors. Italy has none of these cushions. The most likely outcome is scenario 1, managed stagnation. Italy muddles through with negligible growth, rising debt, and gradual decline in relative living standards. This is tolerable in the short term. Italians are wealthy enough to absorb slow impoverishment, but catastrophic over decades, as compounding effects of zero growth accumulate. By mid-century, under current trends, Italy will have fallen from G7 status to middle income levels relative to global peers. Not through crisis or collapse, but through the arithmetic of compound growth. When other economies grow 2% annually and yours grows 0%, you fall behind by 2% every year. Over 30 years, that's a 45% income gap. That's the distance from Germany to Portugal. That's what Italy faces. The debt and stagnation trap is real, and Italy is caught in it.